This is Louis Lapham with The World in Time. My guest is the scholar Harold Holzer, speaking with us today about his new book, published by the Harvard University Press under the title Emancipating Lincoln. The title of your book, Harold, raises a question that many of its prospective readers might not think to be in need of an answer. Emancipating Lincoln from what?
From a clouded reputation made ever more confusing since the dawn of the civil rights movement over his motives for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation and his place in history for his initiative. Does he deserve the mantle that he received in the earliest days of appreciation for the document of Great Emancipator? Have we exaggerated it? Are we ready to come back to an appreciation of it, and hence the title?
How then does the confusion arise, presumably out of the circumstances in which the proclamation was released?
It does indeed. Lincoln couched the proclamation in sort of obfuscatory, legalistic language. But even before issuing it, 150 years ago, September 22nd, 1862, even before issuing it, he clouded his motives and rather confused the public through a series of public relations initiatives and feints that he believed were necessary to prepare a largely racist public for a document that would change the social structure in the country, inevitably. He was terribly worried about the public reaction and did a few things between the summer of 1862 and the fall to make it seem like he cared nothing about the fate of enslaved people.
Take us through the sequence then of 1862. The proclamation is finally delivered on January 1st, 1863, but start with the summer of 62.
All right. In July, Lincoln, and that's the month most of us ascribe his final decision to, he comes to the conclusion that the war cannot be won without his acting against slavery because of what it would do to upset the structure in the home front South and because of the millions of people it would make eligible for military service in the North. It's his last trump, as he calls it. And, of course, he's always wanted slavery to end somehow. A few months earlier, he signed the legislation ending slavery in Washington, D.C., which was a widely applauded piece of legislation, actually more widely applauded than the proclamation would be. So in the summer, he makes this conclusion. He drafts a sketchy proclamation, and on July 22nd, he calls his cabinet together and reads them this draft, and that is the moment that's immortalized in the famous painting, the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation that hangs over the Senate gallery in the United States Capitol. He finishes reading it very proudly, and Secretary of State William Seward says, "You can't do this. This is, with the battlefield catastrophes that the North has been enduring in recent months, this is going to be perceived as our last shriek on the retreat." A great line. And Lincoln, who was prepared to argue back any dissent from his cabinet, said, well, that's a theory that I hadn't thought of. And he agrees to table it until a battlefield victory occurs. And boy, he has a long wait. He has a couple of months.
So the summer of July 1862, the Union armies have been losing a series of battles, and McClellan has been required to give up command. And how does Lincoln then amend the proclamation between July and let's say August and then September?
He actually benefits from one thing, and that is his signature on the Congressional Confiscation Act, so-called, which allows generals in the field to confiscate property, including human property. Unfortunately, it relies on the operations of courts in those regions, and the federal courts are not operating in the South. So Lincoln at least uses the language and feels emboldened and adds that to the draft that he prepares over the summer. But the battlefield climate doesn't change much, and McClellan, who is opposed to widening the rationale for the war to embrace emancipation, has bogged down, as you noted, on the Virginia Peninsula, fails to capture Richmond. And then in August of 1862, the Union and Confederate forces meet in Virginia at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and it's another disaster. So actually, we think of the run-up between July and September as sort of a clear path, but there's another catastrophe that Lincoln has to deal with.
And what are the political circumstances that he has to deal with? What is the attitude toward the freedom for slaves, both in the South and the North, among the abolitionists? Is there division of opinion in the newspapers, for example?
There's tremendous division among in the political world and in the newspaper world. The newspapers are completely politicized at that point. The Democratic newspapers oppose almost everything Lincoln proposes, and certainly propose widening the war to embrace emancipation. The Republican newspapers are generally favoring emancipation in fact, Lincoln is leaking the imminence of emancipation to at least a couple of newspapers. But he's also being prodded by the more liberal papers, like the New York Tribune, to move faster on emancipation. And that inspires this memorable exchange between Tribune editor Horace Greeley and Lincoln in August, in which Greeley writes a blistering editorial called The Prayer of 20 Millions, contending that Lincoln's administration has been, as he puts it, strangely and disastrously remiss in not widening the war to include emancipation. And Lincoln sends a famous reply that he believes will position the proclamation exactly as he wants it. Unfortunately, it's injured his reputation in history, because he says, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. If I could do it by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could do it by freeing no slaves, I would. If I could do so by freeing some and leaving others enslaved, I would do that too. Greeley, who has gotten wind of the proclamation's imminence, admits Lincoln is too smart for him. He sort of retreats from this battle. But there it is, Lincoln saying slavery is not his paramount object, and that's been used against him by historians and others. But he sets the stage. He's setting the stage for a military order, not for a philanthropic order.
And this was understood for what it was at the time, although over the centuries since it's been, as you say, used to make a different interpretation.
Well, Lincoln thought that by couching it as a military order from the commander-in-chief to win the war, end the rebellion, and restore the Union, that he could gain maximum support. And remember, he's facing a congressional election in a few months that will, in fact, turn out to be almost as disastrous as the 2010 for the party, the 2010 off-year elections for the party in power, or 1994 and other famous groundbreaking alignment shifting congressional elections. He's got that to contend with. He's only won about 53% of the northern vote in the election, and he has a loyal Democratic opposition to contend with and keep in line. And then there is endemic racism and the knowledge that there will be whites in the country who will not accept emancipation because it will unleash a competitive labor force that will compete for jobs ultimately. And all of that is mixed in this boiling cauldron of potential opposition. Some people think Lincoln overestimated it and that he was too cautious. But he is a very canny politician, and he has a good sense of the political currents and winds, and so he proceeds very slowly and very cautiously.
And then what is the draft that is read on September 22nd?
Lincoln labors away in his country home, the sort of the Camp David of his day, recently restored and reopened. It's called President Lincoln's Cottage at the Soldiers' Home. It was actually a soldier's convalescent home when Lincoln was president as well. And he commutes to the White House every day with his draft and works on it, pastes in, glues in sections of the Congressional Confiscation Act. And then before the cabinet has this major meeting, Union forces actually succeed in turning back Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Antietam. They have invaded Maryland, caused all sorts of panic, and Lincoln waits patiently, worrying it's going to be another Bull Run disaster. Instead, McClellan sort of triumphs. waits another weekend, and then calls his cabinet together on September 20th or 21st and says, I'm going to read this again too. Actually, first he reads some lines from a joke book, which to the endless irritation of his more dour cabinet members who always think his diversions into the realm of humor are inappropriate. So Lincoln sort of tries to release the tension by reading from a joke book. And then he says, now I'm going to read this proclamation, and I'm not going to ask you your opinion as I did in July, because I made a vow with God that if we won the battle in Maryland, I would release this proclamation, and nothing can now prevent me from fulfilling my pact with the Lord. It's hard to do a cabinet level discussion after that. So he reads the proclamation, which says that if the southern state, the Confederate States, are not back in their proper alignment with the Union by January 1st, 1863, all the slaves in Confederate territory would be thenceforward and forever free. That was the key legalistic language. And this time there's still a little dissent in the cabinet, but Lincoln issues it on September 22nd.
Does he makes it public? I mean, it goes to the newspapers. It's bruited abroad.
It goes to the newspapers, which predictably divide on its impact along party lines. The Democratic papers say that it's an incitement to race war. The foreign papers generally take the same line, especially in Great Britain, and northern newspapers applaud. But it is a delicate balancing act. In fact, the vice president of the United States, Hannibal Hamlin, is on vacation at the time. Vice presidents weren't really part of the executive family in those days. So he was happily ensconced in Bangor, Maine, and he wrote a fan letter to Lincoln. He was an old New England abolitionist, and he said, this is a great moment, it's a great triumph. And Lincoln writes this fascinating reply in which he says, well, I've gotten praise in the newspapers, all that a vain man could wish, but troops come forward more slowly. The stock market is down. Enlistments are declining, and this is not very good. He says, again, he goes back to the editorials. Editorials are good, but breath alone kills no rebels. This is a Lincoln who is a warrior. He wants to conquer and kill rebels. And now he's widened the war, and I think he's frightened still that he's not going to withstand the public outcry.
But the text that is released on September 22, is that the one that's put into law on January 1st, 1863, or does he change it again?
That the September proclamation is the warning. And someone says to Lincoln, because I don't think it was intentional, at least we have no proof of it, but he did wait from September 17th to September 22nd to issue it. And someone pointed out to him, well, you've given the South exactly 100 days notice. And he says something like, well, that's very curious. And there is this, it is the notification. The South is put on notice. No one expects that the Louisianans or the Alabamians are going to throw down their arms and say, well, we're going to lose our slaves, so we'd better give up, because they're in this now to the death and still believe that they can achieve separation and retain slaves. So for the next couple of months, Lincoln starts to write again. He's now writing a final proclamation, and all the while the newspapers are filled with speculation about whether he'll go through with it. Lincoln is perceived by many people at this time as an ineffectual, dithering president who will not make the decisive move. There are parallels to lots of presidents in history. I won't state the obvious, but he rewrites it. He includes in the new proclamation a rather patronizing request that enslaved people do no violence against their masters. He includes the revolutionary provision that African Americans were encouraged now to enlist in the armed forces for the first time, albeit at a lower pay scale than whites at first. And then he adds a peroration that's actually suggested by his Secretary of State, invoking God's blessing on this act. Otherwise, it is still in very dry and legalistic language, but its impact is overwhelming. Karl Marx, of all observers, wrote in England that Lincoln had this peculiar gift for making revolutionary impact with very dry language, the reverse of many American politicians of the day. So that's the document that he issues on New Year's Day, but not before the afternoon, leaving many people convinced that he was going to change his mind and back away.
So between July 22nd, 1862, and the proclamation released on New Year's Day, 1863, how many times has Lincoln revised, rewritten, reorganized the text, and roughly how long is the proclamation, Harold?
It's a couple of thousand words in its final form. We no longer have his autograph version of it. After all of these proclamations went into effect, charity fairs around the country, eager to raise money for the war wounded — there was no organized system for their care or nutrition in those days — besieged him with requests for the preliminary proclamation and the final proclamation. And the great ladies' Northwestern Sanitary Fair, as it was called in Chicago, prevailed upon him to send the final proclamation. And he did. It raised the most money at the fair, and Lincoln actually won a gold pocket watch for donating the most valuable item. In those days, there was no gift prohibition, so he proudly wore the watch. And this document burned in the Chicago fire.
On the release of the proclamation in January, was it received with great rejoicing? I mean, some of the paintings of the era suggest the day of Thanksgiving and the Jubilee and so on. But was that the way it was received at the time?
It was certainly received after hours of the deepest anxiety and prayers in churches, black churches, abolitionist churches all around the country. It was definitely received with jubilation. It was called a day of Jubilee, and with recoiling horror in the South, which stiffened its resolve to resist the Union Army conquest that were necessary to put it into effect. But there's one interesting story that makes the anxiety even higher. And that is that on New Year's Day, Lincoln is set to sign the proclamation, now engrossed, as they called it, by a penmanship expert on vellum paper, so it looked official with seals, etc. And he was going to do that before his annual New Year's Day reception. Well, they bring him the copy, and he notices, I guess we would call it a typo, but it was a transposed phrase in the final paragraph. Just the final paragraph that says, "Unto this document I have hereunto set my seal." He didn't like the way it was phrased. It was incorrect. So he said, "Take it back and do it again." Meanwhile, he went to his New Year's party for hours and hours. And African Americans in churches, abolitionists in meetings, are waiting at for their telegraph news, and nothing is happening. And they're wondering, is Lincoln, in fact, extending the deadline, giving them another chance, backing down? Then the document finally comes at around 3 o'clock. Lincoln has done no special ceremony. He sits in his office with his clerks and the Secretary of State. He picks up the pen to sign it, and then he puts the pen down. Then he picks it up again, and he puts it down. And the few people in the room think, well, he really isn't going to do it. And finally he looks up and says, "I've been shaking hands for 3 hours. And I have no feeling in my hand, and that's not calculated to improve a man's chirography," as he says, a lovely old word for penmanship. And then he massages his hand for about 10 minutes and then picks up the pen. And he says, "I don't want anyone who looks at this document in the future to see a tremulous signature and think that I hesitated, because I believe in this with all my might." And then he wrote a bold Abraham Lincoln and said, "There, that will do." And the news finally goes out.
Last question, Harold. I mean, sum up, if you can, very broadly, in the 150 years since the signing, how has the attitude toward Lincoln shifted from that of the great emancipator to that of the great pettifogger?
Sadly, it's true. And I think I was taught, and people continue to be taught in school, that the proclamation was a political screed that in fact freed no slaves in the areas where Lincoln could free them, and freed all the slaves in areas over which he had no control. And I remind people that the same in fact was true of the Declaration of Independence, which may have declared the colonies independent and free, but in fact had only the value that would be affected by the advance of colonial troops. Same thing with the Emancipation. And in fact, it did free about 600 or 700,000 slaves just by dint of troops marching into the South with little tiny reprints of the proclamation, which I can imagine them handing to plantation owners, to the women left there, and say, here's the document. Your guys are off the plantation. They're free. It revolutionized the armed forces. It helped ensure the victory of the Union and the restoration of the undivided country without slavery. It's misunderstood today because of Lincoln's odd public relations pronouncements between July and September, and because of a general misunderstanding of its impact and the fact that it required fighting to make it work. But I think if you look at the press reports of the day, as much jubilation as there was resistance, outrage. There was a racist recoiling against it. It was very, very controversial, and I think amazingly bold in its time.
Thank you, Harold Holzer, for speaking with us today about Abraham Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm Louis Lapham of Lapham's Quarterly for Bloomberg News. Copyright Bloomberg 2012.